The morning Virginia Carver rode into Dustfall, Texas. She had 43 cents in her coat pocket, a wagon wheel threatening to split clean in two, and a reputation she hadn't earned following her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. But none of that scared her half as much as the name people kept whispering when she asked about the ranch on the hill. Dustfall was not a large town. It sat in the crook of two dry hills like something God had dropped there by accident, and then forgotten about. A collection of weathered buildings that leaned slightly into the wind, as though they'd been listening to it for so long they'd started agreeing with it. The year was 1878, and the Texas plains had been baking under a merciless sun for 3 seasons running. Cattle prices had dropped, 2 smaller spreads had gone under, and the men who walked the main street of Dustfall did so with their hats pulled low and their mouths pulled lower. Virginia pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the general store, climbed down with the careful dignity of someone who had been traveling for 11 days and refused to let it show, and tied her horse, a sturdy roan mare named Pearl, to the post. She pushed open the door, and the bell above it rang with a cheerfulness that the room inside did not share. The storekeeper, a wide man with a flour-dusted apron and suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Help you," he said. "I am looking for work," Virginia said. "I have experience with livestock, with mending, with cooking, and with keeping accounts. I am also not afraid of hard labor, and I can sit a horse better than most men." The storekeeper, whose name was Horace Finch according to the hand-painted sign above his counter, set down his pen and studied her the way a man studies something he isn't sure whether to buy or send back. Virginia was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that had escaped its pins from the journey, gray eyes the color of a sky deciding whether to storm, and a set to her jaw that had persuaded more than one man to reconsider his assumptions about her. "You got kin here?" Horace asked. "No," she said. "I have a wagon, a horse, and the clothes on my back. I was told there was work in this county." "Who told you that?" "A man in Abilene. He said a rancher outside of town was looking for someone to help manage the books and oversee the household. He said the pay was fair." Horace Finch made a sound that fell somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "That would be the Kendrick spread," he said. "Then that is where I will go." Horace set both his palms flat on the counter. "Miss Carver, Virginia Carver. Miss Carver, I am going to tell you something as a courtesy, on account of you being new here and not knowing." He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped like he was imparting a great secret. "Jeremiah Kendrick runs the biggest cattle operation in 3 counties. Pays fair, true enough. But he has burned through 4 housekeepers in 2 years, and every woman who has come to work up there has left inside of a month, some inside of a week." "Why?" Virginia asked. Horace shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that carried a lot of weight in it. "Because the man hasn't got a heart," he said simply. "Cold as a well stone, won't speak unless he has to, won't smile, won't be sociable, won't make any kind of pleasantness with anyone who works for him. The women who came out said it was like working for a wall that occasionally told you what you'd done wrong." Virginia considered this for a moment. "Is the pay truly fair?" she asked. "Among the best in the county. And the work managing the household accounts, overseeing the staff." "That is what he needs, yes. His last bookkeeper was old Walt Hims, and Walt died in February. The accounts have been sitting untouched for 3 months. "Then I will go," Virginia said. "I am not looking for pleasantness. I am looking for honest work and honest pay." Horace Finch looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression must have convinced him that arguing further was a waste of both their time. He told her the road to take, the gate to look for, the ridge she would see the house from. He also told her, as she was turning to leave, that Jeremiah Kendrick was 29 years old, that he had inherited the ranch at 23 when his father died, and that in the years since, the ranch had doubled in size, and the man himself had become something of a legend, respected absolutely, liked by almost no one, and understood by nobody at all. Virginia thanked him, bought a small bag of cornmeal and some dried beans with her 43 cents, loaded them into her wagon, and drove out of Dustfall toward the ridge. The road to the Kendrick ranch climbed steadily out of the valley, winding through stands of live oak and cedar that gave way to open pasture where fat longhorn cattle grazed in the yellow afternoon light. Virginia counted the cattle as she drove and found herself impressed against her will. The fences were straight and well-maintained. The water troughs she passed were clean. Whatever Jeremiah Kendrick was as a man, he was clearly something as a rancher. The house sat on a gentle rise with a view of the whole valley below. It was not the grand plantation manor she might have imagined. This was working Texas, after all, not the old South. But it was solid and well-built. 2 stories of limestone and timber with a wide front porch and a proper barn 50 yards to the east. Smoke came from a chimney at the back, which meant a kitchen was running. Virginia pulled Pearl to a stop in the yard and climbed down. A young hand with a sunburned face came from the barn at a trot. "Help you, ma'am," he said. "I am here about the housekeeping and bookkeeping position," she said. "Who do I speak to?" The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, tilted his head toward the house. "Mr. Kendrick's in the study," he said, then added with what seemed like genuine concern, "He's in a mood." "Thank you," she said, and went up the porch steps and knocked on the door. Nobody answered for a full minute. Then the door opened. Jeremiah Kendrick was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of lean, sun-darkened build that came from years of real work rather than any vanity. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw was square and carried about 3 days of stubble. His eyes were the color of river water over dark stone, a deep, particular brown that had the quality of seeing things clearly and registering them without sentiment. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "I didn't send for anyone," he said. "No," Virginia agreed. "But you need someone. Horace Finch in town tells me your books haven't been touched in 3 months. My books are my business. They will be my business too if you hire me. Virginia Carver. I have experience with cattle operations, household management, and debentry ledger keeping. I am not afraid of hard work and I do not require pleasantness." Something moved in his expression, not quite surprise, not quite amusement, but something in that neighborhood. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The interior of the house was clean but spare. The furniture was good quality and showed years of use. The walls had no decoration except for a single map of the county pinned next to the front window. The floor was swept. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and coffee. He led her to the study, which was at the back of the house and looked out over the east pasture. The desk was covered with papers in a state of organized chaos that someone clearly understood, but that would look like catastrophe to anyone else. There were 2 ledger books open, a third closed on the corner, and a stack of cattle buyer correspondence that had been sorted by date. "You know debentry?" he asked without preamble. "My father kept the accounts for a cattle operation in Missouri for 12 years, she said. "I learned beside him. When he died, I kept them myself for 4 years until the operation was sold." "Why was it sold?" "My father had debts I didn't know about," she said evenly. "When he died, those debts came due. I settled what I could and sold the rest. That is why I am here." He looked at her again with those river-stone eyes. "How old are you?" 26. "How old are you?" A beat of silence. 29, he said. "The pay is $12 a month with board. You would have the upstairs east room. You are responsible for the household accounts, the payroll records, the cattle purchase and sale ledgers, and any correspondence that requires arithmetic. You manage the household staff, which at present consists of 1 cook named Clara who does not need managing because she has been running this kitchen for 15 years and will tell you so." "That sounds reasonable," Virginia said. "If you cannot keep up, I will tell you. I will not be polite about it." "I would prefer you weren't," she said. "I find false pleasantness wastes everyone's time." He stared at her. She looked back at him without flinching. Something in the room shifted, the way barometric pressure shifts before weather. "The room is at the top of the stairs on the right," he said. "Supper is at 6." And that was the interview. Virginia carried her bag up the stairs, found the east room, which was small but had a good window with a view of the open pasture and a proper bed with a clean quilt, and sat on the edge of it for a moment, just breathing. The mattress was real cotton ticking. The floor was smooth-planed pine. Outside, she could see 3 longhorn steers moving slowly through the evening grass. She had slept in her wagon for 11 nights. She pressed her hand flat against the quilt and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the fragile, cautious beginning of relief. Clara was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with silver-streaked black hair and a manner that could be described as both formidable and deeply kind, depending on which side of her you were standing on. She set a plate of salt pork, beans, and cornbread in front of Virginia at the kitchen table that first evening, poured a mug of strong coffee, and sat down across from her with the air of a woman who had already made a decision. "You will last longer than the others," Clara said. "How do you know?" Virginia asked. "Because you didn't ask me how difficult he is. The others always asked that first thing. You just sat down and ate." Virginia almost smiled. "How difficult is he?" Clara pointed a finger at her. "There it is, but it's different when you ask it after eating." She folded her hands on the table. "He is not difficult, he is quiet. There is a difference. People mistake silence for coldness, and they are not the same thing at all." Virginia filed that away and said nothing. "He was not always this way," Clara added, after a pause. "Or perhaps he was always this way, and people have simply invented a story about why." Virginia went to the study after supper and opened the ledger books. She worked for 3 hours by lamplight, tracing the entries old Walt Hymns had made, understanding the system he had used, mapping in her mind the shape of the operation. Jeremiah Kendrick's ranch carried just over 800 head. He employed 11 hands, 2 of whom were full-time and the rest seasonal. He had a standing contract with a beef buyer in Fort Worth and a secondary arrangement with a buyer in San Antonio. His expenditures were meticulous and his income was strong. But in the 3 months since Walt's death, 6 transactions had gone unrecorded, 2 invoices had been paid twice, and there was a discrepancy of $41 in the March accounts that needed tracing. She was still working when she heard the study door open. She looked up. Jeremiah Kendrick stood in the doorway holding a lamp of his own, clearly not expecting to find the room occupied. "I can leave," she said. "No," he said. He came in, set his lamp on the side table, and stood looking at the open ledger in front of her. "What are you finding?" "Double payment on the March Salt Lick invoice," she said, turning the book so he could see. "And 6 entries missing from the cattle movement record. Also, you have a standing balance with the Holloway feed supplier that hasn't been acknowledged in the ledger. It shows as settled, but I found a receipt in the stack that suggests it was extended to credit." He leaned over the desk, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the smell of cedar and honest work, and looked at the page she indicated. "Holloway told me it was settled," he said. "He lied. Or the record was confused. Either way you want to look at it." He straightened. "How long will it take you to work through all of it?" 3 days if I work full days. 2, if you answer my questions promptly when I have them." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. It happened fast, like a bird crossing open sky. "I'll answer promptly," he said. "Then 2 days," she said. He took his lamp and left, and Virginia sat for a moment in the quiet and thought about what Clara had said about the difference between silence and coldness. The first week at the Kendrick Ranch settled into a rhythm that surprised Virginia by being comfortable. She rose early, took coffee with Clara in the kitchen before the hands came in for their morning meal, and then went to the study to work. Jeremiah would appear at some point in the morning, sometimes to ask a question, sometimes simply to retrieve something from the shelves, and they would exchange what was necessary and then return to their separate occupations. On the 4th morning, she found a problem in the records that required his immediate attention. One of the seasonal hands, a man named Craddock, had been drawing pay from 2 separate entries in the payroll ledger, once under his own name, and once under the name R. Crade, which appeared to have been a fiction created after old Walt's eyesight began to fail. She brought the ledger to Jeremiah where he stood by the corral fence watching two hands work a young horse. He looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "How long has this been going on?" "At least 8 months based on the pattern in the records," she said, his jaw tight. "Thank you," he said. "I will handle it. Do you want me to calculate the exact amount that was taken?" Yes, she did. The number was $67.40. Jeremiah confronted Craddock that afternoon. She could see them talking from the study window, or rather, she could see Jeremiah talking and Craddock looking at his boots. The man packed his kit and left the ranch before sundown. That evening, Jeremiah came to the study doorway. $67.40, he said. Walt Hims never found it. Walt Hims was dealing with failing eyes and a failing heart, Virginia said. It was not his fault. Craddock was careful. You weren't careful, Jeremiah said. You were fast. She looked up at him. I know what to look for, she said. He nodded once slowly. You do, he said, and then he left. It was, she would think later, one of the most direct compliments she had ever received. The second week, she began learning the shape of the land. Clara suggested she ride Pearl out to see the pasture divisions, understand how the grazing rotation worked, get a sense of the distances involved so she could understand the logistics behind the numbers she was recording. Virginia took that advice on a Tuesday morning when the air was clear and cool and smelled of sage. She rode the south fence line first, then cut north through the middle pasture where the largest herd grazed. She was halfway across when she heard a rider behind her and turned to find Jeremiah Kendrick coming up at an easy lope on a tall gray horse. He pulled alongside her without preamble. Clara said you went out without a guide, he said. I have 2 good eyes and a sense of direction, she said. You are also on land that shares a boundary with the Hollies brothers spread, he said, and the Hollies brothers do not respect property lines. This was a real thing in Texas in 1878. Boundary disputes between ranchers were constant, sometimes deadly, and frequently conducted without reference to the law. Virginia had heard of it but hadn't yet had occasion to navigate it herself. Are they dangerous? She asked. They are opportunists, Jeremiah said. Which is worse? He rode beside her without speaking for a while, and Virginia found that the silence between them had a different quality outdoors than it did inside the house. Inside, silence had the texture of a held breath. Out here, with the wind moving through the grass and the cattle moving in slow herds at the edge of vision, it felt more like peace. How many head have you lost to boundary disputes? She asked. 11 in the past year, he said. The Hollies brothers claim they found them strayed. And the law? The county sheriff is a reasonable man, but cattle disputes require witnesses, and the Hollies brothers are careful not to be witnessed. Virginia looked out across the south fence. You should keep a movement log, she said. Every head that grazes within a quarter mile of the Hollies boundary should be tallied in the morning and checked again at evening. Any discrepancy becomes documented evidence. Jeremiah looked at her. That brief bird expression crossed his face again. I hadn't thought of doing it systematically, he said. Most problems have systematic solutions, she said. Is that what you believe? She hesitated. Most of the time, she said. Some problems don't. He didn't ask her which kind she'd been living with. She was grateful for that. They rode back to the house together, not hurrying, and somewhere in the middle of that ride Virginia realized that she had stopped thinking about where she was going to go next, which was something she had been thinking about almost constantly for 2 years. She pushed that realization away quickly, the way you push away something warm when you're afraid of burning yourself. The third week brought a complication. A letter arrived from a land office in Austin, and Jeremiah brought it to Virginia with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, which was frustration so thoroughly suppressed that it looked almost like nothing at all. There is a legal claim being filed against the northeast quarter of this ranch, he said. A man named Beaumont claims my father signed an agreement in 1865 giving him rights to that land in settlement of a gambling debt. Virginia looked at the letter. It was official stationery, properly formatted. "Do you have your father's papers?" she asked. "In 2 trunks in the back bedroom," he said. "Then we look." They spent the better part of 2 days going through those trunks together, side by side at the kitchen table, with Clara keeping coffee warm and occasionally peering over their shoulders. The papers were a chaos of personal letters, receipts, contracts, and miscellaneous documents that Jeremiah's father had apparently kept with the same philosophy one might apply to throwing things into a closet and hoping for the best. It was Virginia who found it, on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Not an agreement giving land to Beaumont, but a letter, dated November 1865, in which Beaumont himself thanked the elder Kendrick for a small personal loan and stated explicitly that no other debts or obligations existed between them. The letter was in Beaumont's own handwriting, and it made his claim against the Northeast Quarter a fraudulent one. Jeremiah held the letter for a long time. His hands, Virginia noticed, were very still, the kind of still that happens when a person is controlling something strong. "He is going to try to take land that has been in my family for 20 years, Jeremiah said. "He was going to try," Virginia corrected. "Past tense. We'll send this to the land office along with a sworn statement." He looked at her. The expression on his face was not the brief bird-crossing sky expression she had catalogued before. This was something slower and deeper, and she had the sudden unsteady feeling of standing near the edge of something that had no bottom. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, not unkindly, as though he genuinely wanted to understand. "Because it is my job," she said, "and because it is the right thing. Your job is the household accounts." "My job is to be useful," she said. "That is always my job." He said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice that was quieter than his usual one, he said, "I owe you more than a month's wages for this." "You owe me exactly $12, she said, "and perhaps a cup of Clara's coffee." Clara, from across the kitchen without looking up from her bread, said, "Already poured." The land claim was resolved within 3 weeks. The letter was irrefutable, and Beaumont withdrew his claim before it could go to a hearing. The Northeast Quarter remained Kendrick land. During those weeks, something had shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment she could point to. It was more like the change of seasons, which happens over many days and announces itself only in retrospect. Jeremiah had begun leaving the study door open in the evenings. He had begun coming to supper instead of eating in the kitchen alone, which Clara told Virginia was something he had apparently stopped doing after his last housekeeper left. He had begun occasionally to speak without being spoken to first. Nothing enormous, just more. One evening in late May, with the sky going extraordinary colors outside the window and the day's heat beginning to lift, he came to the porch where Virginia was sitting with the payroll ledger balanced on her knee and said, "My father built this house himself. He and 2 hired men over 2 summers." She looked up. He was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed, looking out at the valley rather than at her. "That is a considerable undertaking," she said. He was a considerable man, Jeremiah said. He had no formal education. He taught himself to read from a Bible and a copy of a Shakespeare play, and those were the 2 books he could quote from beginning to end. He paused. He was not good with money. That was always the weakness. He meant well and trusted people too much. "Beaumont," Virginia said. "Men like Beaumont," Jeremiah agreed. "He always believed people were better than they were." "Is that why you don't?" she asked, and then wondered if it was too direct. He was quiet for so long that she thought she had pushed past what he was willing to share. Then he said, "When you inherit a thing, you learn what it cost. And you start to see every risk as what it could destroy, rather than what it could build." Virginia set the ledger down and looked at him properly, at the clean line of his profile against the evening sky, at the weight he carried in his shoulders, at the particular quality of his stillness that she had slowly begun to understand was not emptiness, but rather the opposite of it. "That seems like a lonely way to run 800 cattle," she said. He turned and looked at her then with those river-stone eyes, and for a moment she felt thoroughly seen, which was a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. "It has been," he said, and then he went inside. Virginia sat on the porch for a long time after that, watching the stars come out over the Texas hills, and told herself very firmly that she was a practical woman with a practical situation, and that the warmth moving around in her chest was simply gratitude for steady employment. She almost believed herself. June came in hot and dry, the way Texas June always did. The cattle operation moved into its most demanding season. The hands worked long days moving the herd to the water sources. The fencing crews were out before dawn, and the kitchen ran from 4 in the morning until 8 at night. Virginia adapted her schedule accordingly, rising earlier, working the afternoon accounts during the heat of the day when outdoor work was impossible, and spending the cool mornings helping Clara manage the provisions ordering and the hands' payroll. One particularly brutal afternoon, when the temperature had to have climbed past 100 degrees and the air smelled like hot iron, Virginia carried a water pail out to where 2 of the youngest hands were working on a section of downed fence. She had seen them from the study window, just boys, really, 19 and 20, working without hats in the direct sun, and something in her had simply stood up and walked to the water barrel and filled the pail. She was walking back from that errand when she encountered Jeremiah coming from the north barn. He looked at the empty pail in her hand, looked at the fence line where the 2 young hands were now drinking from the dipper, and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "That was kind," he said. "It was practical," she said. "Heat-struck hands can't fix fence." "Both things can be true," he said. She looked at him, he looked back at her. Something moved between them that neither of them acknowledged, that both of them felt. "Are you eating enough?" he asked abruptly. "Clara says you have been working through the midday meal." Virginia blinked. "Clara says that. Clara tells me things she thinks I should know," he said with a dryness that was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him, "whether I ask or not." "I am eating fine," Virginia said. "I eat at my desk." "Come to the table for meals," he said. Not a command exactly, or perhaps it was a command, but one that had something else underneath it, something more like concern wearing a command's clothing. "All right," she said. She came to the table from that day forward, and Jeremiah came too. Clara served them without comment, though her expression whenever she looked at them together held a quiet satisfaction she did nothing to conceal. The days grew longer, and the evenings were extraordinary, that deep purple-gold Texas light that made even the dusty air look like something worth keeping. Virginia began staying on the porch in the evenings as a matter of course, and Jeremiah began appearing there with a cup of coffee as though he had always done it. They talked about the cattle, about the weather, about the land. They talked about books. He had his father's Shakespeare and his own small collection, and Virginia had brought 3 volumes in her wagon and had borrowed another 2 from the Dustfall lending library that operated out of the minister's parlor on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. They talked about everything except what was growing between them, because Virginia was a practical woman who had learned not to trust warmth until it proved it could sustain heat, and because Jeremiah Kendrick had spent 6 years building walls that he had grown so accustomed to that he had nearly forgotten they were walls rather than simply himself. Then the thing that changed everything happened on an ordinary Thursday in the first week of July. A woman came to the ranch. She arrived in a proper carriage, well-dressed for Dustfall, with the particular composure of someone accustomed to making entrances. Her name, as Virginia learned from overhearing Clara, was Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, a widow of 40 from the town of Carver, who had been corresponding with Jeremiah for reasons that became suddenly and uncomfortably clear when Clara said, in a low and pointed voice, "Her cousin is the pastor in Dustfall, and she has been making inquiries about this ranch for 6 months." Virginia absorbed this information while standing very still in the study doorway. She went back to the accounts. She worked with great concentration on a column of numbers that she had already added correctly twice. She added them again. Jeremiah came to the study an hour after Adelaide Marsh arrived. He sat down in the chair across from Virginia, which he had taken to doing when they needed to discuss the ledgers, and looked at the desk without saying anything for a long moment. Virginia did not look up. "She is an acquaintance of the Dustfall pastor," he said. "So I understand," Virginia said. "I have corresponded with her," he said, about the possibility of a household arrangement. Virginia's pen kept moving across the page. The numbers were perfectly formed. Her hand was very steady. "A sensible thing to consider," she said. "I corresponded with her before you arrived," he said. Which was, she recognized, not nothing, it was a clarification, a location of events in time, and she recognized it as such even as she told herself it didn't matter. "You do not owe me an explanation, Mr. Kendrick," she said. The formality of the title, she had been calling him Jeremiah in her head for weeks and had only occasionally slipped and said it aloud, seemed to strike something in him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I suppose I don't." Adelaide Marsh stayed for supper. She was gracious at the table, spoke easily about Carver, about the pastor and his congregation, about the difficulties of running a household as a widow. She looked at Virginia with the practiced evaluation of a woman who had learned long ago to assess another woman's role in any room. Virginia answered when spoken to, served her portion, and felt the particular pain of someone watching a future being shaped without them. After supper, while Jeremiah walked Mrs. Marsh to the porch, Virginia helped Clara clear the table. "She is not right for him," Clara said, without preamble. "That is not my business," Virginia said. "No," Clara agreed. "It is his business to realize it." Mrs. Marsh left the following morning in her carriage. Virginia saw her go from the study window and then return to the accounts and worked with a focus that would have impressed anyone watching her. Jeremiah did not come to the study that morning. He did not come to the midday meal. He was in the north field with the hands, and she saw him from the window, a dark figure against the pale summer grass, moving with the deliberate efficiency that characterized everything he did. That evening, he came to the porch. He brought 2 cups of coffee and set one on the rail beside where she was sitting. He stood for a while without speaking. "She was the right sort of woman on paper," he said finally. Virginia picked up the coffee cup. "Is that what you are looking for?" she asked. "The right sort on paper." He looked at the valley. The sun was going down behind the western hills in colors that were almost violent in their beauty. "I don't know what I am looking for," he said. "I have been managing this ranch for 6 years and I have been absent from everything that is not the ranch." "You are not absent," Virginia said. "You are here every day." "Present is not the same thing as not absent," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sunset, and the light caught the side of his face in a way that made him look younger and also more serious. And she thought about what Clara had said, that he was not always this way, or perhaps he was always this way and people had invented a story about why. "Who told you that you had no heart?" she asked. He turned and looked at her sharply. "Horace Finch," she said by way of explanation. "He told me before I drove out here. He said you were cold as a well stone and had no heart. I am curious who told him that." Jeremiah was quiet for so long that she thought again she had pushed too far. Then he said, "When I was 23 and my father died, a woman I had been attached to looked at what I had inherited and saw debt and work and chose not to stay. She told people in town I had nothing to offer but silence and labor." He paused. "People in small towns with long memories build legends out of small events." "She was wrong," Virginia said. He looked at her. "She was wrong," Virginia said again steadily. "I have been here 2 months. I have seen how you treat your hands, how you manage this land, how you handled Craddock and Beaumont, and every problem that came. A man with no heart does not worry whether his youngest hand is drinking enough water in the heat. A man with no heart doesn't," she stopped herself. "Doesn't what?" he asked. "Doesn't leave coffee on the porch rail," she said. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It had a shape to it, a particular gravity. "Virginia," he said, and her name in his voice was something she had not anticipated, quiet and deliberate, each syllable placed carefully, like something he had been carrying and was now choosing to set down. "Yes," she said. I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." "I always answer honestly," she said. "Are you planning to stay?" he asked. "Beyond the usual term. Do you intend to stay here?" She looked at him, at the directness of his face, at the question behind the question in those river-stone eyes, at the slight tension in his jaw that told her this was not a casual inquiry, that something was riding on the answer. "I had not made a plan," she said carefully. "I make plans when I have things to plan around." "What would constitute something to plan around?" he asked. "A reason," she said. "A real one." He set down his coffee cup on the rail. He turned to face her fully, and she stood from the chair so that they were level, so that she was looking at him straight. "You are the only person in 6 years who has made this house feel like something other than a ledger I am trying to balance," he said. "You are the only person who has—" He stopped, started again. "I do not know how to say this without sounding like a fool." "Then sound like a fool," she said gently. "The sky is very wide out here. Nobody will hear." Something broke open in his face, not painfully, not dramatically, but the way ice breaks on a river in March, in the way that reveals moving water underneath. "I do not want you to go," he said. "And I am aware that is a significant thing to say to a woman who works for me, and that I have handled approximately nothing in my personal life with any competence whatsoever, and that I have very little practice saying what I actually mean to another person. But you asked me who told me I had no heart, and the answer is that I told myself, because it was easier than admitting that I did have one and that it had been waiting. For something I couldn't name." He paused. "I can name it now." Virginia's heart was doing something she would have expected to be undignified in a practical woman of 26, which was beating very fast and very hard. "You can name it," she said. "You," he said. "I can name it as you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, just that, just her palm against his jaw, the gesture both simple and enormous, and felt him lean into it the way a person leans into warmth after a long cold. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He put his hand over hers, and they stood there on the porch of the ranch his father had built, while the Texas stars came out one by one above the hills, and something that had been silent for a very long time began to speak. He kissed her on the porch with the gentleness of a man who understood that some things are rare and should not be rushed. It was the kind of kiss that did not demand anything, that simply said, "I am here," that Virginia felt all the way down to the soles of her boots. When he stepped back, his expression had changed in a way that was difficult to describe, as if something that had been locked had been unlocked and the key was still in his hand, and he was still deciding whether this was real. "Virginia," he said. "Jeremiah," she said back, with the particular quiet firmness of someone claiming something. He smiled. It was the first full, real smile she had seen from him, not the brief bird-crossing sky motion, not the suppressed almost expression, but a real smile that rearranged his entire face and made him look like someone his father might have recognized in his better moments. Clara was watching from behind the kitchen curtain. Neither of them could see her, but she was there, and she was smiling too. The weeks that followed were not suddenly simple. The ranch still required the work it always required. The accounts still needed to be kept. The cattle still needed to be moved, and the fences mended, and the hands paid and the suppliers corresponded with. Virginia was still employed in a professional capacity, and they were both careful about that, about the distinction between what was proper and what was not, which in 1878 Texas mattered in ways that were more than social. But the evenings on the porch became something they both arrived at as surely as they arrived at meals, and the conversations between them deepened and widened in the way that conversations do when the people having them have stopped being careful about what they reveal. She learned about his childhood, the father who was warm and impractical, the mother who had died when he was 12, the years of learning the ranch from the ground up because his father understood the land but not the numbers. He had taught himself accounting from a borrowed textbook and made every error possible before learning what worked. He learned about her Missouri years, the father who had been a good man and a good accountant but a private one, who had never told her about the debts that accumulated against the business. The 4 years she spent after his death trying to settle what could be settled, selling what had to be sold, leaving what she had always called home with 43 cents and a wagon and the certainty that she was capable of beginning again somewhere. "Were you frightened?" he asked one evening, "when you drove into Dustfall?" "Yes," she said, "but I have learned that frightened and capable are not opposites." "No," he agreed, "they are not." "Were you frightened when I knocked on your door?" she asked. He thought about that. "I was unsettled," he said. "You were not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would ask me to smile more," he said. She laughed. It surprised both of them, not because it was unusual for her to laugh, but because it was so natural, so easy, and because the sound of it made Jeremiah look at her with an expression that was pure and uncomplicated and very close to joy. "I have never asked anyone to smile more," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why you unsettled me." In August, two things happened that between them reshaped the landscape of everything. The first was that Tom Carver, Virginia's older brother, arrived at the ranch unannounced on a Wednesday morning. Tom was 32, a solid man with Virginia's gray eyes and considerably less of her patience. He had been looking for her since she left Missouri. Not urgently, because Tom had his own troubles, but with the persistent background worry of a man who loves his younger sister and has not heard from her in 6 months. He rode into the yard, took in the sight of the ranch, asked the young hand in the barn who he was talking to, and ended up at the front door with his hat in his hand, looking at Jeremiah Kendrick with the careful assessment of a man who is trying to read a situation from the outside. Virginia heard his voice from the study and came downstairs. The reunion was genuine and somewhat chaotic, involving Virginia hugging her brother hard and then holding him at arm's length to determine whether he had been eating properly, which she decided he had not. Tom looked from his sister to the quiet, watchful man standing a few feet away and made the sort of rapid mental calculation that older brothers have always made. "Mr. Kendrick," he said, extending his hand. "I am Tom Carver, Virginia's brother." "I know who you are," Jeremiah said, shaking it. "She has spoken of you. You are welcome here." Tom stayed for 4 days, sleeping in the spare room, eating at the table, helping with the morning work in the way that men who have grown up around ranching simply do without being asked. He rode fence line with the hands, helped move a section of the herd to new pasture, and watched Jeremiah Kendrick with the careful eyes of a man, determining whether another man is worthy of his sister. On the 3rd evening, he found Jeremiah alone in the barn, checking a mare's foreleg that had been bothering her, and stood in the barn doorway with his arms folded. "She left Missouri with 43 cents, Tom said. Jeremiah looked up from the mare's leg. "She told me," he said. "She could have come to me," Tom said. "She did not because she is the most stubborn person I have ever met in my life and she believes she should manage her own affairs without assistance." "I have noticed that about her," Jeremiah said. "She is also," Tom said, his voice shifting, "the best person I know. She sat with our father every day for the 4 months he was dying. She settled the debts when she didn't have to. She could have walked away from them legally. She stayed because it was right." He paused. "If you are whatever you are to each other, I want to know that you understand who she is." Jeremiah set down the mare's hoof and stood. He looked at Tom with the directness that was his fundamental character. "I understand exactly who she is," he said. "I intend to ask her to marry me if that is what you are trying to determine." Tom looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly. "Good," he said. "That is good." Tom left on the 5th day, heading back to Missouri, with a promise from Virginia to write monthly and a handshake from Jeremiah that contained the understanding of men who have reached a mutual regard. The second thing that happened in August was the storm. It came in fast on a Saturday night with the specific ruthlessness of late summer Texas weather. The sky went green at the edges, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour, and then the wind came in from the northwest with a sound like nothing good. Virginia had seen weather like this in Missouri and knew what it meant. She went to find Jeremiah before the rain started and found him already in the barn with 2 hands, getting the horses settled. "The herd," she said. "The hands are moving the south pasture cattle to the high ground north of the creek," he said. "The west herd is already sheltered." He looked at her. "Get back to the house. I can help, Virginia." His voice was quiet and completely firm. "I cannot worry about the cattle and worry about you at the same time. Please go to the house." She went to the house, because she was a practical woman and she recognized the logic, but also because there was something about the way he had said it, the acknowledgement of the worry, the pleas that carried weight she wanted to sit with. Clara was in the kitchen, moving with the efficiency of a woman who had weathered 30 years of Texas storms. They worked together securing the shutters, moving breakables from surfaces, filling the large iron pot with water from the pump before the pump could flood. By the time the rain hit, the house was as ready as it could be made. The storm lasted 6 hours. It took the roof off the south corner of the small equipment shed, downed a section of fence along the east boundary, and dropped 2 inches of rain in 3 hours. It also, which Virginia only learned afterward, caught one of the young hands, the 19-year-old with the sunburned face whose name was Billy, in the open pasture when the lightning started. Billy was not struck, but he fell from his horse when the animal spooked and landed badly, and it was Jeremiah who found him in the dark rain and carried him, over a considerable distance, back to the barn on his own back. She learned this from another hand the following morning. Billy's wrist was fractured and his pride was battered, but he was otherwise sound. When she asked Jeremiah about it, he shrugged in a way that suggested the matter was closed. "He's a good kid," he said. "I was not going to leave him out there." "You carried him," she said. "It was not far." "Jeremiah," she said. He looked at her. "You are an exceptionally good man," she said. "I want you to know that I see that. Even when you would prefer I didn't notice." He looked at her for so long. With that expression she had stopped trying to name and started simply receiving. And then he crossed the kitchen to where she was standing by the window, put his hands on her face very carefully, the way you handle something worth keeping, and kissed her in a way that was nothing like the gentle first kiss on the porch. Clara, entering with an armful of mending from the back room, turned around and went back out without a word, and they could both hear her laughing all the way down the hall. 3 days after the storm, while they were surveying the fence damage together on horseback, Jeremiah pulled his gray horse to a stop on the ridge above the east pasture where the valley spread out below them in the clean post-storm light, everything washed clear and green and brilliant in the August morning. He dismounted and she dismounted, and they stood together at the ridge's edge, and he said, "Virginia, I want to ask you something." She turned to face him. He was not looking at the valley. He was looking at her, with an expression of complete sincerity that she had seen building in him for weeks, that she had not allowed herself to be certain about until this moment. "I am not a poet," he said, "and I am not a man who speaks easily, but I have found in the past 4 months that silence is not the same as having nothing to say. It is sometimes having too much to say and no adequate language for it." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the color of a Texas river on a clear day. "I bought this in Dustfall 3 weeks ago," he said. "I have been waiting for the right moment." "I think perhaps there is no right moment. I think perhaps you simply choose a moment and step into it." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about 43 cents and 11 nights in a wagon and a bell above a door ringing with false cheerfulness and a man in a doorway who had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and said, "I didn't send for anyone. I did not come here looking for this," she said. "I want you to know that. I came here looking for honest work." "I know," he said. "That is part of why I am asking. I have never met anyone less interested in performing what they feel than you are. What you feel, you simply are." He paused. "Will you marry me, Virginia?" She looked at the ring, at the sky, at the valley below them that had become, without her quite deciding to allow it, something she thought of as home. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Jeremiah." He put the ring on her finger with the particular care of someone who has spent a great deal of thought on this action in advance. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. Jeremiah Kendrick, who was steady about everything, whose hands were steady when he confronted a thieving hand and steady when he rode through a storm and steady when he carried a hurt boy across a dark pasture. Those hands had a slight tremor in them. She put her free hand over his and held it still. "There it is," she said softly. He looked at her. "What?" "Your heart," she said, "beating hard enough to shake your hands." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a real, full, unguarded laugh that she had never heard from him before, that turned out to sound like water over stones, like something released from a long captivity, like the best possible answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. They were married in September. The wedding was held at the Dustfall church, which was small but held the whole town comfortably, which was a good thing because the whole town came. Horace Finch was there with his wife and 3 children. Billy, the young hand with the mended wrist, was there in a clean shirt that was too large for him but earnestly pressed. Clara wore her good dress dark green, with her silver hair pinned under a proper hat, and sat in the second row with the expression of a woman who has won a long and patient bet against fate. Tom Carver rode down from Missouri again, arriving the day before the ceremony, and stood beside Jeremiah at the front of the church with the quiet pride of a man who has satisfied himself that his sister is safe and loved, and exactly where she is supposed to be. The minister, who was the pastor whose cousin was Adelaide Marsh, performed the ceremony with great sincerity, and if he noticed any irony in the proceedings, he kept it to himself. Virginia wore a dress of cream-colored wool that Clara had helped her alter from a bolt of fabric ordered from the dry goods store, with her auburn hair pinned up in a way that allowed a few pieces to escape at the edges, which she had always been unable to prevent and had stopped trying. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Billy had picked that morning from the field east of the barn, looking very proud of himself for having thought of it. When she walked down the aisle and saw Jeremiah standing at the front in his good dark coat with his hair properly cut for the first time since she had arrived, looking at her with those river-stone eyes that held everything he felt without apology or concealment, she thought, "This is what it looks like when a person who has been alone for a long time remembers that they are not alone." She thought this, and then she walked toward him. The vows they said were the traditional words, but when Jeremiah said, "With this ring I thee wed," his voice was quiet and absolute, the voice he used when he was certain about something. And she heard in it every evening on the porch and every cup of coffee on the rail, and every moment he had chosen to step toward her instead of remaining safely alone behind the walls he had built so well. She said her own vows in the same voice she had used when she told him she would not go anywhere steady and clear, and meant with everything she had. When it was done, when the minister declared them husband and wife and Jeremiah kissed her in front of the whole of Dustfall, Texas, there was a sound from the assembled town that was part cheer and part astonishment, because Jeremiah Kendrick had kissed his wife as though the whole town was not watching, which was to say with complete, unself-conscious sincerity. And several people in the church who had been repeating the cold as a well-stoned story for years would need to revise their assessments significantly in the days that followed. Horace Finch leaned over to his wife and said, very quietly, "I told her he had no heart." His wife looked at him. "It appears," Horace said, "that I was not correct." The reception was held in the church yard, with Clara's food, which was extraordinary, and fiddle music provided by one of the older hands who turned out to be remarkably gifted, and a great deal of the general cheerfulness that communities generate when something they had quietly given up on turns out to go well. Jeremiah danced. He was not an elegant dancer, but he was a determined one, and Virginia, who had learned to dance from her father in a Missouri kitchen, fit into the frame he made for her as though the space had always been there. "You are dancing," she said to him during the second song. "I am attempting to dance," he said. "You are doing better than attempting," she said. "Where did you learn?" "I haven't," he said. "I am learning now." She laughed, and he looked at her while she was laughing with the expression that was his particular way of feeling joy, looking at the source of it as if he wanted to understand exactly what he was in the presence of. They drove home to the ranch in the late afternoon, in the wagon, with the hills going golden and the air beginning to cool and pearl. The roan mare, moving at her own easy pace, because Virginia had never in her life pushed Pearl when she didn't need to. Jeremiah held the reins in one hand and had his other arm around Virginia's shoulders, and she had her head resting against the side of his jaw, and the road wound up through the live oaks and the cedars and the open pasture toward the house on the rise, and neither of them said very much, because there was nothing that needed saying that the moment was not already saying. Clara had left supper on the stove and a lamp burning in the window, and she herself had tactfully retired to her cottage at the far end of the property, which she returned to on the occasions that called for it, and she would not be back until morning. Virginia stood in the kitchen and looked at the supper on the stove and the lamp in the window, and Jeremiah stood beside her, and for a moment they were simply two people in a room that felt entirely and completely like home. "We should eat," she said. "We should," he agreed. They ate together at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and talked the way they always talked about the ranch, about what needed doing, about Tom and whether he had looked thin, about whether Billy would be back to full strength in time for the fall work, and also between the practical things about other things, softer things, things that have no names in the accounting ledgers that Virginia kept so carefully. After supper, Jeremiah washed the dishes. Virginia had never seen him wash dishes before, and she stood in the kitchen doorway watching him do it with the same methodical care he brought to everything, and something about the sight of it, this large, serious, quiet man in his good wedding coat with his sleeves rolled up washing supper dishes, made her feel something so vast and uncomplicated that she could not have described it in any language she possessed. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and kept washing. The autumn season brought its own particular beauty to the Texas hills. The light changed, going from the white heat of summer to something amber and slanting that made everything look like a painting from which all the unnecessary details had been removed. The cattle were fat from the summer grass, the fall drives were planned, and the Kendrick ranch moved into the harvest of everything that had been tended through the difficult months. Virginia settled into the dual role of wife and household manager, with the naturalness of someone who had always been a capable person, and had simply been waiting for a context in which capability could take root. She expanded the record-keeping system she had established in her first months, creating a more comprehensive tracking model for the cattle movements and the supplier accounts, and worked with Jeremiah on a negotiation with the Fort Worth buyer that improved their contract terms by enough to matter. She also, in the small hours of an October morning, told Jeremiah that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, over early coffee, before Clara arrived. She had known for 2 weeks and had wanted to be certain before she spoke, because she was a woman who did not speak until she was certain. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light, and the expression on his face was one she had not catalogued before. It was something beyond the river-stone steadiness and the brief bird movements and the rare full laughter. It was something raw and enormous and entirely undefended. He stood up, came around the table, and held her very carefully, the way you hold something you understand to be both precious and strong. "Virginia," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know," she said into his shoulder. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am practical and capable, and I have been taking excellent care of myself." He laughed, that water-over-stone sound, but with something additional in it, something overcome. "Yes," he said, "you have." He held onto her for a long time. She let him. Clara arrived an hour later, looked at the two of them standing in the kitchen with cups of coffee and expressions that gave everything away, and said, "Well, finally, I have been expecting this news since August." "August," Virginia said. "You have been eating crackers in the morning. Clara said comfortably. I know what crackers in the morning mean. She began making breakfast with the air of a woman who has been waiting for the plot to catch up with her. Boy or girl, I will know how to manage either one. Virginia looked at Jeremiah. He looked at her. They both looked at Clara, who was cracking eggs into a bowl as though she had arranged this herself, which perhaps she had. The winter passed gently. Tom wrote from Missouri that he was doing well, that the land he had bought with his savings was coming along, and that he expected to visit in the spring and would not be giving them any more scares by arriving unannounced. Billy's wrist healed completely, and he proved to be an exceptionally talented hand with horses, which Jeremiah recognized and began to develop deliberately. The Hollies brothers attempted one more boundary incursion in November, were caught by the systematic movement logging that Virginia had put in place, and faced enough documented evidence that their lawyer advised them strongly against pursuing the matter. The Beaumont claim had been closed. The Craddock fraud was resolved. The Holloway credit issue had been properly settled. The accounts were in better order than they had been in years, and the operation was positioned well going into the next year. On a cold night in December, when the fire was going in the front room, and the ranch was quiet under a half-moon, Jeremiah read aloud to Virginia from his father's Shakespeare. He read from As You Like It, which had always been his father's particular favorite, and Virginia sat beside him with her mending and listened, and the fire spoke its own language in the grate, and outside the window the Texas winter lay quiet and silver over the hills. Your father had good taste, she said. He had very little taste, Jeremiah said, with the warm dryness that had become one of her favorite sounds in the world. He simply fell in love with 2 books and stayed in love with them his whole life. That sounds like good taste to me, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at her mending. In the firelight he did not have the words for it. He had never had the words. That was all right. He had learned that some things did not require words, that some things were simply held and honored in the spaces between language. He reached over and put his hand over hers, which rested on the mending in her lap. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They stayed like that until the fire burned down. In the first week of April, a boy was born. The labor was long and handled by the midwife from Dustfall, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had delivered most of the town's children for 15 years. Clara was in and out of the room all night with hot water and calm authority, and Jeremiah sat in the hallway outside the closed bedroom door for 9 hours without moving, in the way that men of that era were expected to endure the most difficult moments of fatherhood, which was at a distance. When Mrs. Aldridge opened the door and said, "A son, Mr. Kendrick." "Mother and boy are both well." He stood up, and the expression on his face was such that Mrs. Aldridge, who was not a sentimental woman by professional necessity, was moved considerably. He went into the room. Virginia was propped against the pillows with the particular exhausted radiance of a woman who has accomplished something enormous. The baby in her arms was red-faced and emphatic in his early opinions, which he expressed at volume. Jeremiah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that had no category. That was simply Jeremiah Kendrick in the presence of something that had permanently changed the perimeter of everything he understood about himself. He looked at Virginia. She looked back at him. "Hello," she said, which was what she said when she meant something large. "Hello," he said back. She held out the baby. He took him with the careful, deliberate steadiness of a man who does not know how to hold a baby but is absolutely determined to learn in the next 30 seconds. The boy surprisingly settled. "He knows you," Virginia said. Jeremiah looked at his son's face, the small closed eyes, the frowning forehead, the tremendous insignificant perfection of him. "What shall we call him?" Jeremiah asked. Virginia had been thinking about this. "Robert," she said, "after your father." He looked at her. There was that expression again, the one she had no name for, the one she simply received. "Robert Kendrick," he said. "Robert James Kendrick," she said. "James was my father's name." He looked at her for so long, with the river-stone eyes full of something that had no bottom. "Robert James Kendrick," he said. "Yes." Tom arrived in May as promised, arriving with proper advance notice this time, and a carved wooden horse that Robert James Kendrick was not yet old enough to appreciate, but that Tom placed on the mantelpiece with great ceremony. He stayed for 2 weeks and spent half his time in the baby's company, expressing opinions about the shape of the child's ears and the strength of his hands, and the general quality of his character, with the bias available only to doting uncles. He sat with Jeremiah one afternoon on the porch, both of them watching the hands move a section of the herd, and Tom said, "She is happy." "I know," Jeremiah said. "I don't mean comfortable," Tom said. "I mean happy, the way she was as a girl before." He stopped. "She carries things, you know that." "Yes," Jeremiah said. "She does not look like she is carrying them alone anymore," Tom said. Jeremiah looked at the valley, at his land, at the cattle moving in the late afternoon light, at the house his father built with 2 hired men over 2 summers, at the smoke from the chimney that meant Clara was in the kitchen and supper was coming, at the window of the upstairs east room where Virginia was, at this moment, nursing Robert James, and probably also reviewing the June payroll in her head. "She isn't," he said. The summer of 1880 was a good one. Rains came at the right intervals. The herd grew. The Holloway supplier relationship was formally renegotiated to better terms, and the Fort Worth cattle buyer increased his standing order by 15%. Billy, now 20, turned out to have such an extraordinary gift with horses that Jeremiah gave him a formal position as head horse handler, and a raise that made the boy look like he had been struck by very good lightning. Virginia expanded the household garden because she had discovered that she liked growing things even more than she had expected to, and because the cook's garden Clara maintained had always been too small for Clara's actual ambitions, and because Robert James, at 10 months old, was deeply interested in the vegetable beds as a place to sit and investigate dirt, which he did with great seriousness whenever she brought him outside. One August afternoon, Virginia came back from the garden with Robert James on her hip and found Jeremiah sitting on the porch steps with a letter in his hand. He looked up when she came up the path, and she could read the expression on his face. He had never been difficult to read, not to her, not after everything. "What is it?" she asked. "Offer on the ranch," he said. "From a land company out of Dallas. They want to buy. The price is more than fair." She sat down on the step beside him with Robert James between them. She looked at the letter, she looked at the valley, she looked at Jeremiah. "Do you want to sell?" she asked. "No," he said. "I never want to sell. I want to know if this is what you want, to stay here, this life." She looked at him. She looked at the valley, at the hills she had learned by riding them, at the cattle she could count and name by their place in the herd, at the garden she had planted, and the house she had made into something that felt entirely different from what it had been when she arrived, at the east room window that had been the first thing she had put her hand against and thought, "This could be home." She looked at Robert James, who was, at this moment, chewing earnestly on the edge of her sleeve and watching a butterfly with the intense philosophical focus of a person who has recently discovered that the world contains butterflies. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes." "I drove 11 days through empty country with 43 cents in my pocket and a wheel that nearly gave way 3 times, she said. "I knocked on a door and a man told me he didn't send for anyone. I sat down at his desk and spent 3 months proving that I could see what needed to be seen and fix what needed to be fixed." She paused. "And then I found out that the coldest man in 3 counties had been keeping his heart in a place so careful that even he had nearly lost the map to it." She looked at the letter in his hand and then at his face. "No, I do not want to sell. I want to grow more cattle and fix the east fence line that has needed attention since February and teach this boy to ride when he is old enough and plant apple trees in the south garden because Clara has wanted them for 30 years and you keep forgetting to do it." He looked at her. He looked at Robert James, who had moved on from her sleeve to his father's boot, which he regarded as equally worth investigating. He looked at the valley. He tore the letter in half carefully and set the halves on the step. "I will see about the apple trees," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her. Robert James, finding both parents satisfactorily anchored, applied himself to the boot buckle with renewed determination. In the fall of that year, Clara's apple trees were planted, 12 of them along the south garden wall, a variety that the nursery supplier in Austin said would take 4 years to produce fruit. Clara supervised the planting with the authority of a woman who has been waiting too long and intends to make sure the thing is done right. 4 years, she said, watching the young trees go into the ground. "You have been here 15 years, Virginia said. 4 more will not ruin you." Clara looked at her. "It is not about patience," she said. "It is about the knowing. When those trees fruit, I will know that this place is settled, that it will be here." She looked out at the ranch, at the house, at the barns, at the mended fences and the clean water troughs and the hands moving about their work and the cattle in the pasture. "Things can be taken away," she said quietly. "Jeremiah's father knew that. Jeremiah knows that. You know that. It helps to plant something that takes 4 years to prove itself. It says, I believe this will still be here." Virginia put her hand on Clara's arm for a moment. They stood together in the October light watching the apple trees go into the earth. She thought, "I believe this will still be here." She thought, "I know." That winter brought snow, which was not unheard of in central Texas but was unusual enough to make it remarkable. The hills went white and quiet. The cattle huddled in the low ground near the water sources, and the ranch had the still, enclosed feeling of a world momentarily simplified. Robert James, at 17 months, saw snow for the first time from the kitchen window and stood with his nose pressed against the glass for fully 20 minutes, transfixed. Jeremiah lifted him up so he could see better, and the boy pointed at the white hills with the imperial gesture of a person who is not sure what he has discovered but is certain it is his. "Snow," Jeremiah told him. Robert James said something that was either snow or a word of his own invention. "Close enough," Jeremiah said. Virginia, standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and watching the two of them at the window, thought about what Clara had said about knowing, about things being here, about the believing of it. She thought about the 11 days in the wagon. She thought about 43 cents. She thought about Pearl, her roan mare, who was healthy and well-fed and living the best life of any horse in the county, which she deserved. She thought about the ledger books and the double payments and the fraudulent land claim and the movement logs and the storm and the porch and the ridge above the east pasture and a ring with a turquoise stone and a church full of people who had been wrong about a man and were glad to have been wrong. She thought, this is the life, not a perfect life, not a simple life. The cattle would always present problems, the weather would always be uncertain, the land would always require work. The accounts would always need keeping, and the world outside the ridge was still what it had always been, often unjust, sometimes hard, full of people who lost things they deserved to keep and kept things they did not deserve. The year 1880 was not kind to everyone in Texas. The Comanche people who had lived on this land for generations had been displaced, forced onto reservations at gunpoint, in a process of violence and injustice that Virginia was aware of, and that Jeremiah had spoken of with a quiet, complex gravity that told her he understood the weight of what it meant to own land in a country that had stolen it. They could not undo those things. They could only be honest about them, and live with that honesty as a weight they did not pretend away. But within the life they had within the specific world of the Kendrick Ranch and the Dustfall Valley and the hills that went golden in October and white in December and brilliant green after the spring rains, this was the life, and it was real and it was theirs. Jeremiah turned from the window with Robert James on his arm and looked at her in the kitchen doorway. "You look pleased about something," he said. "I am," she said. "What?" She smiled at him, her full smile, which she gave without calculation because she had never been the kind of person who calculated her smiles, but which he had told her once, on the porch, in the particular quiet of a confession, was the thing that had made him understand what the word home was supposed to mean. "Everything," she said. He looked at her with the river-stone eyes that held everything clearly and without embellishment and said, in the quiet, absolute voice he used when he was certain, "Yes. Everything." Robert James, between them, pointed at the white hills outside the window and made his snow sound again, claiming it all for his own. The apple trees bloomed for the first time 4 springs later, in 1884, exactly as the nursery supplier had promised. Clara stood in the south garden on a morning in late April when the trees put out their white blossoms, and put her hand on the nearest trunk, and said nothing for a long time. By then, the Kendrick ranch had grown again. 2 more parcels purchased from willing sellers, the herd approaching 1,200 head, the operation requiring 14 full-time hands and a larger seasonal crew. Virginia had hired an assistant for the accounts, a young man of 20 named Fletcher who had come west from Virginia, the state, not the woman with a head for numbers and a willingness to learn, whom Virginia trained with the same direct efficiency with which she had always approached everything. Jeremiah had become, in the years since the wedding, something that surprised him continuously, which was a man at ease. Not simple ease is not the same as simplicity, but at ease, in the way that a person is at ease when they have stopped fighting their own nature and allowed what is real to be visible. He spoke more. Not a great deal more. He was fundamentally a man of few words and always would be, and Virginia had long since ceased to want otherwise, because she had learned to read the words he did use with an accuracy that made volume irrelevant. But he laughed more often, and the laughter was his own, and he had developed over 4 years the habit of reaching for her hand whenever they were standing near each other, the way you reach for something you have already established as both present and necessary. Robert James Kendrick at 4 years old was a specific and serious person who shared his father's quietness and his mother's gray eyes and had, apparently, inherited from some ancestor unknown to either of them, an extraordinary passion for horses. He went to the barn with Billy whenever permitted and watched the horses with the absorbed intensity of a student who has found his subject. Virginia told Jeremiah about the second baby in October of 1883, in the kitchen, over early coffee, just as she had told him about the first. This time, he did not need to stand up and come around the table. He simply reached across it and took her hand and looked at her, and the expression was different from the first time, but no less, it was deeper, if anything, because it was built on everything that had come before it. "Robert James will be thrilled," he said. "Robert James will be jealous for approximately 3 weeks and then become fiercely protective," Virginia said. "I predict it with confidence." "You are very sure of things," he said. "About this family," she said. "Yes, I am." In April of 1884, in the same week that Clara's apple trees bloomed, a daughter was born. They named her Eleanor after no one in particular. They simply liked the name, its sound, its weight. Eleanor Clara Kendrick, the Clara being offered as tribute to the woman who had, in her own opinion, arranged the whole thing from the beginning and deserved the acknowledgement. Clara, when told, made the face of a person who is very moved and intends to show none of it whatsoever, and then made a batch of her extraordinary apple cake and put it on the table for supper, and refused to discuss the naming further, which meant she thought of it constantly. Robert James, who was 4 and old enough to understand the concept of a sister if not to appreciate all of its implications, went through precisely the 3 weeks of jealousy Virginia had predicted, and then positioned himself as Eleanor's foremost protector with such seriousness that even Jeremiah had to turn away to compose himself on several occasions. On a Sunday afternoon in June, with Eleanor 3 months old and sleeping in the cradle that Billy had made from cedar wood as a gift, Virginia and Jeremiah sat on the porch in the late afternoon light. Robert James was in the barn with the horses. Clara's apple trees were in full leaf in the south garden, their branches moving in the easy summer wind. Horace Finch had told Virginia, 11 months before she arrived, that Jeremiah Kendrick was cold as a well stone and had no heart. She looked at her husband on the porch beside her. He was reading one of her books this time, because they had been lending them back and forth for years now, and the distinction between yours and mine had long since collapsed. The evening light came across his face. Robert James's laughter drifted from the direction of the barn. Eleanor made the small, contented sound of a sleeping baby who has decided that the world is acceptable. Jeremiah looked up from the book and caught her looking at him. "What?" he said. "You have a heart," she said. He looked at her with the steadiness that was his fundamental character, with the river-stone eyes that held her clearly and without diminishment, with the small corner of a smile that was not the rare full thing but something quieter and deeper and always available. "I know," he said. "You found it." She reached over and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers without looking away from her face, the gesture as natural as breathing, as certain as the hills, as ongoing as everything they had built in this place together. The apple trees would fruit next summer. The cattle were fat on good grass. The accounts were in order. Robert James would learn to ride this fall. Eleanor would grow and become herself in ways that neither of them could predict and both of them were ready for. Tom would come at Christmas. Billy would stay and grow and become the kind of man that good work and good circumstance can produce when given the chance. Clara would be here, in her kitchen, arranging the world with the quiet authority of someone who has earned the right. The valley lay below them in the last of the day's light. Their valley, their hills, their fence lines and water sources, and the cattle moving slowly through the evening grass. The house his father built, the books they shared, the ring with the turquoise stone. Virginia Carver Kendrick sat on the porch of the ranch on the hill and held her husband's hand and watched the stars come out over Texas, and felt the particular peace of a person who has arrived, fully and finally, exactly where they are supposed to be. It was not the end of difficulty. The land would always require fighting for, the weather would always be uncertain, the world would continue to contain Beaumont's and Holly's brothers and injustices older than any of them. The years would bring things they couldn't predict, good and hard alike, because that is what years do. But she was here. He was here. They had found each other in the particular way that people find each other when they are both, at the same moment, done pretending that silence is the same as having nothing to say. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The porch held them both. The Texas evening held the porch, and the whole wide country lay open around them, not threatening, not demanding, not requiring anything of them in that particular moment except that they stay. They stayed.